for a number of years. Gallup World Poll was completed in 2007 and continues to be done now. We've known that. Gender rights. Well, we know what Muslim women are like. I mean, you know, we hear somebody talk about the fact that women in Saudi Arabia can't drive a car. We always grab the important indices, don't we? You know, they can't drive a car. I mean, it's not that women shouldn't have the right to drive a car, but there's a heck of a lot more going on in Saudi Arabia. We don't talk about the wealth that women in Saudi Arabia own, for example. We don't talk about the education, the role of women in education. We don't talk about changes that are taking place. But anyway, what do we discover when we actually talk to majorities of women and men, that majorities in the Muslim world believe that women should have equal rights, equal opportunities to education, equal opportunities to employment. Now, why they don't have it, in light of that, becomes the next iteration. You know, is it their government? Is it still the hold of patriarchy? Is it the elites in their society? Is it the religious leaders in their society? And then a final point, and this brings me into the transition that's important, is that all famous question of, why do they hate us? Well, first of all, most people in the Muslim world don't hate us, just like most people in the world don't hate us. But many people in the Muslim world, like many people in other parts of the world in the last 10 to 15 years, are anti-American, i.e. they have a problem with American foreign policies. Not that they have a problem with America, that they don't admire us. And often we would say, well, see what hypocrites they are? You know, they're anti-American, and yet they want to come and study here. They want to buy property, they want to live here, they want to work here. No, for many, this is seen as a great country to great country to study in or live in. I mean, it was in terms of what we stand for, but it wasn't seen as a great country in terms of whether or not we promoted those very things in their part of the world. In other words, for example, after the fall of the Soviet Union, we promoted democracy aggressively in many parts of the world, including Eastern Europe. We didn't say of Eastern Europe, well, it's going to be slow. They've had communism for 3 or 4 decades. Who knows if they can take it? It'll lead to instability. We don't know who might get elected. We didn't use any of those arguments. In the Middle East, we did. Okay? And this was admitted by the first Bush administration. Not blaming this on President Bush. What, in fact, Ambassador Richard Haas, who was a senior State Department official, said before we went into Iraq, and to also justify the support for greater democratization, he noted that every administration, Democrat or Republican, including the first part of the Bush administration, had not promoted democracy in the Middle East. It was not seen as in our national interest. Yet we often criticized, when convenient, this part of the world for having authoritarian governments and having human rights problems, even though we supported the authoritarian governments, giving them significant foreign aid, military assistance, training their military, their security forces, etc. But when we actually look at data, what do we find? We find that majorities in the Muslim world admire our technology, our economic development, our work ethic, our freedoms, our commitment to self-determination. They admire all of those things. The only problem, and again it comes out in the data, is that they think that there's a double standard, i.e. that these things were not being promoted in their region because we supported the Ben Alis of the world, the Mubaraks of the world, etc. We could support Mubarak at a time when human rights organizations were referring to his human rights record as 10 years of torture. So that was out there. So now we've got the great expectations. Well, at the end of the day, what we see is then that on the one hand, people are saying it's policy, not culture or civilization. They're saying it's not that we don't like Western civilization or Western culture, it's your policies that affect us. You don't walk the way you talk. Well, what actually then has happened? In many ways, many of the promises that were made have still not been fulfilled. Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, the abuses in terms of our domestic situation in terms of civil liberties, a more balanced policy on Palestine and Israel. Look at the most recent veto, even at this point, by the American administration with regard to settlements. So you've got our administration, the Obama administration, vetoing on the issue of settlements, the very policy that Obama so strongly supported. We now veto a resolution dealing with that. And so you had many, not only in the region, but you had people like Mr. Wolfowitz, who was the Assistant Secretary of Defense, writing in foreign policy, and in effect saying, our policy's been vindicated. The Obama administration actually, he was saying, is in fact falling into line with much of our foreign policy. So that brings us up to, in a sense, the question of what then did the administration promise? What were some of the things? What could and should it have done? And then how does that play off against what we're seeing now going on and what we need or should be doing? Well, one of the things that the president talked about in Cairo, and I have to, I mean, truth in not lending, but in whatever, my wife and I are both strong supporters of President Obama, although I've been reasonably, I think reasonably, some may think not reasonably, critical of a number of his policies, feeling that for political reasons and others, the administration hasn't been as strong as it should be. But the president acknowledged what in fact we also see in the Gallup data and in other polling, that Muslim grievances had to do with political and economic grievances, not with culture, and in particular a grievance that said we want respect for Islam and for Muslims. In other words, the grievance was that many in the West do not respect Islam, the religion of Islam. We're not talking about the terrorist here, the religion of Islam, and don't respect Muslims. In other words, that Muslim blood and Arab blood is not valued the way the blood of others is valued. Now, you can think a bit about why that might be the case. We quite rightly are very strong on the statistics on every American who has been killed or injured in Iraq or Afghanistan. We somehow find ourselves incapable of actually keeping statistics on the vast numbers of people who have been killed, Iraqis and Afghans, on the amount of the collateral damage, etc. And there are lots of other incidents, from the Danish cartoons to etc. That reinforce the sense that there's not an even playing field. We live in a culture where, try it sometime, go and look at the news on Fox, read some of the websites, or read some of the columns in the newspapers, and substitute the word Judaism and Jew for Islam and Muslim, and see whether or not that piece would have been published. Or substitute the word African American, for Muslim, and see whether or not the kind of racist language that one used to be able to get away with regard to blacks, or with regard to anti-Semitic language with regard to Jews, no longer is tolerated. That isn't even allowed in the public square in the name of freedom of speech or freedom of expression. It's fair game. In reporting on Egypt, you wind up with some of the really right-wing reporters talking about a new Hitler in Egypt. I mean, using phrases like that with no problems. The Quran is a terrorist book, or I had a little incident I'd love to tell because I had this personal experience. When people ask me if I've had any dangerous situations, well, I was in the airport flying to Houston, and there was somebody there, a Texan flying back to Houston, and I know he's an exception, but we're buying newspapers and he's in front of me, and he gets a bottle of water, and he bought a couple of other small articles, and they rang it up, and he had to use his credit card, or at least he felt he should, because suddenly it was like $20 or $22. And so they were commenting on how things have changed in the last few years, and he said, yeah, travel. And I think part of it was probably the idea that you can't bring your water in your own, you have to then come in and buy it, and you're spending all this money. So he said, oh, those Muslim bastards, that's the first line. And then he turned to me, put his face right into me and said, and one of them's our president. We've got a Muslim president. And he nodded to me like, right, I mean, I know the stats, and I know that's out there, but it was kind of interesting to be up close and personal, with this kind of, statement. But in any case, that situation's there. So what do we hear the president talk about? Respect for Islam and Muslims, and working hand in hand with Muslim countries. That he would lead with diplomacy rather than with the military. Lead with diplomacy rather than the military. An emphasis more, and I advocated and others, that there should be more of an emphasis on technological, economic, and educational development rather than use of military and providing military hardware to many of these governments. Indeed, limiting that hardware. Engaging in dialogue with mainstream opposition. And redress the Bush administration's engagement in a policy of moral exceptionalism and the abuse of power in the name of national security. Well, at the end of the day, as I said, in a number of areas, one can take a position either way, but in terms of what was set out, when you look at Guantanamo, when you look at Abu Ghraib, when you look at our voting pattern, when you look at the policy in Afghanistan and the increase of a military presence, when you look at the increase of drone attacks, however, quote, effective they are, they're not all that effective in winning hearts and minds in terms of the amount of collateral damage that takes place. And when you look at the, as it were, the imbalance in terms of however horrendous our losses are to the losses that are taking place, profound questions get raised. Okay, so along comes now the unthinkable. Nobody expected what we saw. The idea that Ben Ali would fall in Tunisia as fast as he did was astonishing. The idea that Mubarak would fall as fast as he did was unbelievable. I mean, keep in mind what we're talking about here. Just put this in perspective for you. Okay, I'm okay on time. I'm looking for reassurance here. Okay. Okay, you keep taking notes. She wasn't taking notes for the first 5 minutes. I want you to know I noticed that. That made me feel that I had said nothing worth taking notes on. Okay? Now, if she had a computer, I would be accusing her, if she were typing away, of actually doing her surfing on the internet, which I've also learned that students do. I spoke at Cornell, and I warned students not to do it. My nephew's a graduate student there, so I said to him, he was sitting behind one of the kids on the computer, I said, was he surfing the internet? He said, yep, Uncle John. So anyway, okay. Nobody expected this to happen. Think about the nature of these governments. They're called, in the Arab world, they're called mukhabarat states, security states. Okay, what does that really mean? It means that these are governments that are led by kings, military, and ex-military. Okay, they're not there because of popular sovereignty. They're not there because they're elected. These are governments that therefore have a problem with their legitimacy and therefore are concerned about their security, their endurance as a regime. So what do they rely on? They rely on their security forces, their military, their secret police, their above ground secret police. Okay, they rely on the use of arrest, holding people, military tribunals, torture, etc. You can go Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Iran. I mean, I could do this until the end of my talk. Okay, so you've got those kinds of regimes. These are governments that when they do have elections, more often than not, they're rigged. Or at least they're imbalanced enough that if a ruler scores under 90%, he becomes absolutely depressed. When Mr. Ben Ali came to power, he was up against the leader of the opposition, a man who's lived in exile now for about 25 years and has just gone back, Rashid Ghanouchi, the head of the Islamic movement there. And Ben Ali came to power through a coup. Now, I was briefing the several new ambassadors to North Africa, and one of the questions became, what about the future of Tunisia and stability, and also Algeria? And at one point somebody said, well, we know what Ben Ali represents, this man who had come to power. With Ghanouchi, we know what he says, and it sounds good, but we don't know what he would do. And I said, well, that's a really good question, but A, we never know that with any politician, in a sense. You know, we know what they say, we don't know what they're actually going to do in office. I said, more importantly, what with Ben Ali, we know both what he says and what he's done. I.e., came to power with Bourguiba, who took power and never left, became president for life, okay, for decades. He then overthrew his boss. He then promised democratic elections. When they had elections, and Ghanouchi and the Islamic movement scored roughly 17% of the vote in the urban areas, he suddenly discovered that this was a terrorist movement, had military tribunals, Ghanouchi was found guilty in absentia, had to flee to London, got political asylum. People were thrown into prison.